House Oversight Republicans are beginning proceedings to hold former President Bill Clinton in contempt of Congress after he refused to sit for a deposition regarding his involvement with Jeffrey Epstein. Hillary Clinton is also refusing to comply, and the two of them are citing politically motivated actions intended to embarrass them as the reason why. Let's dig into it. So, Axios is reporting today that the oversight chairman, James Comer, a Republican from Kentucky, is escalating their attempts to probe Bill Clinton's connection with Jeffrey Epstein. But both Bill and Hillary Clinton are refusing to comply with these subpoena requests. They've released statements, their lawyers have outlined their reasoning in a letter to Comer, and there's lots of back and forth happening on social media around this. First of all, let's remember exactly what Bill Clinton's reported association to Epstein was and what the newly released Epstein files in December revealed further. Now, this release of photos and other heavily redacted documents from the Epstein files was not the full extent of what Congress was required to do by law. A lot of organizations around ending sex trafficking and survivors of Epstein themselves have argued that Congress must do much more to comply with the law that forced them to turn over these documents. Their redactions may actually be protecting their political allies instead of helping these victims get justice. In addition to those heavily redacted documents, there were also a slew of photos released, and some of these photos included Bill Clinton. So let's revisit what some of those photos looked like. And as a note to viewers, this topic is very disturbing, so exercise caution in watching this moving forward. Reuters released a trove of these photos, and these redactions were already there when the files were released to protect victims' identities. Former US President Bill Clinton swims in a pool. We can see what appears to be Ghislaine Maxwell next to him, and then the black box covering presumably a victim's face. And that is very obviously Bill Clinton in this very gaudy, expensive looking hotel pool. That's not the only photo of Bill Clinton surrounded by Epstein's associates and alleged victims. We have this photo with Bill Clinton, and it's captioned former US President Bill Clinton, Mick Jagger, and Ghislaine Maxwell via the US Justice Department. We have this picture of Bill Clinton at a table with Chris Tucker posing together. We have this crude sort of mock up of Bill Clinton's face on the body of a woman wearing a dress. And this painting was apparently displayed inside the Manhattan home of Jeffrey Epstein. Then finally, we have this picture of Bill Clinton with Michael Jackson and Diana Ross. I should also note that Diana Ross's son came forward online to say that one of the people covered up in this picture was him. What's interesting about that is there have been a lot of allegations made that the way that Congress is disseminating these Epstein files has been politically biased and motivated to try and embarrass people who they view as their ideological enemies while covering up pertinent information related to their allies, such as the current president, Donald Trump. At the same time, Comer is saying that he can't subpoena Trump or force him to testify because he's a sitting president. So already here, we very clearly have a discrepancy between who's being held accountable by this committee and who's being excused. When you're dealing with allegations of this severity, including sex trafficking and child sexual abuse, there shouldn't be any sort of distinction based on who's in what political party or who's currently in office. But as we've seen multiple times with Trump, the powers that be keep letting him avoid accountability just because he's been reelected. Now, I want to read a little bit from a statement that both Bill and Hillary Clinton posted on X, as well as their lawyer's official letter to Representative Comer about why they wouldn't be attending their deposition. These statements and letters are really long and filled with a lot of legal jargon, but let's summarize and go through some pertinent parts. So, in this statement that Bill and Hillary Clinton posted on X, they initially opened the letter by talking about various ways that Trump's administration has sort of failed the American people during his tenure thus far. And while a lot of this is true, I would say that it doesn't have very much to do with the topic of hand of their potential connection with Jeffrey Epstein. But going a little deeper into the letter, there are some interesting excerpts here. For example, I'm going to read from a few paragraphs here. So, Bill and Hillary write, despite everything that needs to be done to help our country, you are on the cusp of bringing Congress to a halt to pursue a rarely used process literally designed to result in our imprisonment. This is not the way out of America's ills, and we will forcefully defend ourselves. Indeed, bringing the Republicans' cruel agenda to a standstill while you work harder to pass a contempt charge against us than you have done on your investigation this past year would be our contribution to fighting the madness. We have tried to give you the little information we have. We've done so because Mr. Epstein's crimes were horrific. If the government didn't do all it could to investigate and prosecute these crimes for whatever reason, that should be the focus of your work, to learn why and to prevent that from happening ever again. There is no evidence that you are doing so. Instead, you have forced the victims to relive their painful experiences while doing little to give them and everybody else what's deserved: truth and justice. There is no plausible explanation for what you are doing other than partisan politics. So that's a little excerpt from Hillary and Bill's statement that they released directly to the public. There's also a letter obtained by the New York Times that their lawyers sent directly to Comer. So let's look at that. Yesterday, the New York Times published this: read the Clintons' legal letter to Comer. Lawyers for Bill and Hillary Clinton wrote a letter to Representative James Comer of Kentucky, the Republican chairman of the Oversight Committee, on why the couple would not testify in the House's Jeffrey Epstein investigation. Yet again, we have a really, really long document that's absolutely full of legal jargon, but I want to go through it and summarize some of what's here. First of all, their lawyers are arguing that the Clintons have no requirement to provide information to Congress about Jeffrey Epstein and Ghislaine Maxwell, but that they're doing so proactively and voluntarily. They write, despite the fact that the subpoenas are invalid and legally unenforceable, untethered to a valid legislative purpose, unwarranted because they do not seek pertinent information, and are an unprecedented infringement on the separation of powers. As we go through this letter, the various subheadings basically spell this out. They say that the subpoenas are invalid and legally unenforceable because they seek testimony with no connection to a valid legislative purpose. They say that the testimony sought by the subpoenas has no pertinence to the stated purpose of the committee's investigation. They say the committee is unable to remedy these defects despite its shifting rationales for the subpoenas. They say that these subpoenas are intended to harass and embarrass former Secretary Clinton and former President Bill Clinton. They say that insisting on in person testimony can have no purpose but to harass and embarrass them. And finally, they say that the subpoenas are an impermissible exercise of law enforcement authority committed to coordinate branches of government. So, what does all of this mean, and what's the significance at play here? First of all, as somebody who has reported on sexual assault allegations and the legal processes around them for a long time, when I read this statement and when I look at how these lawyers are responding, a couple things stand out to me. First of all, in the statement released by Bill and Hillary Clinton, there is a lot of information on these pages that is kind of intended to deflect from the matter at hand. They talk about all of these really valid issues with how Trump is currently governing the country, but none of that really pertains to the allegations that Bill Clinton was intimately involved with what Jeffrey Epstein was doing. And we do have a lot of photographic evidence as well as testimony from some of those Epstein survivors regarding them seeing Bill Clinton on Epstein's island. That's something that one of Epstein's survivors spoke about that I heard from her directly when I was reporting on the Epstein case. So we know that at least Bill Clinton was involved, and no amount of deflection or distraction is going to change that. But at the same time, when they talk about the politically partisan nature of this process, there's some truth to the idea that this has been a politically partisan process. It just doesn't mean that the Clintons are necessarily innocent. For example, we know that Donald Trump and Jeffrey Epstein were very close, and that in the process of releasing the Epstein files and in these subpoenas, and as the investigation proceeds, Trump has basically been excused from a lot of this by his fellow Republicans. And that's not fair either. It doesn't matter what political party these people are in. If they were associated with these crimes, then they need to be held accountable. In fact, ironically, Bill Clinton and Donald Trump are being accused of a lot of the same things with regards to Epstein. They were both close with him in the 90s and in the early 2000s. They both traveled on his plane. Their contacts were in his little black book. They visited his properties. Bill Clinton was seen on his island. He denies that, but some of the Epstein survivors have said so anyways. And at the end of the day, they're two of the extremely powerful, wealthy people who were within Epstein's inner circle. With regards to what that means and any criminal liability they may face or any crimes they may have witnessed or partaken in, we need more investigations to get to the truth of this and deliver accountability for these victims. Another thing that I wanted to touch on is the argument that all of this is part of a distraction. So, a lot of people have speculated that Trump's actions in recent months and weeks around the release of the Epstein files are to deflect from his potential role with Epstein. For example, his military intervention in Venezuela, the deployment of ICE in Minneapolis, and other sort of chaotic issues in our politics and news cycle right now, they've all been pegged as potential distractions. I think the reality of what's happening is that all of these various events stand alone as really important for scrutiny and news and investigation. But the reality is, with a news cycle this hectic, there has been an effect of distracting people from the Epstein files. There was much more chatter about this on social media and in the news more broadly a few weeks ago before Trump started rolling out all of these other things. I think that if Bill and Hillary Clinton had released these statements or refused to testify at the end of December, we'd be hearing a lot more about that now than we are today. That's because a lot of people are focusing in on what's happening with ICE or some of these other topics. But that doesn't just benefit the Clintons, it also benefits Trump as well as all of the other associates who have evaded scrutiny following Epstein's death. I think my big takeaway here is that the Trump administration and its allies cannot be trusted to hold Trump or his allies responsible. That's obvious. At the exact same time, we can't let Democrats get away with associating with Epstein either. And what I've seen from people on the left is that they too want Bill and Hillary Clinton to be held responsible, particularly Bill Clinton, after seeing these photographs, hearing the words from Epstein's survivors, and learning more about their connection. Ultimately, at the end of the day, abuse affects everyone, and the issue of holding abusers accountable should be nonpartisan. The Clintons may have a solid legal foundation to justify why they refuse to testify, but that's not going to satisfy what the American public wants and ultimately needs to hear. Sexual abuse is so serious that people need to know that there will be an accountability process. And until that happens, there's still going to be a lot of attention, rightfully so, being paid to the Epstein files.